Well, yes, participants, we continue our workshop. And I'd like to invite our next speaker, Anastasia Mozokhina, from the Nikольский Mathematical Institute of the People's Friendship University of Russia. And the title of the talk is Blood clotting due to thromboinflammation in the lungs diseases, but in the pulmonary circulation. So, Anastasia, please, you have 60 minutes.
Thank you.
You have 30 minutes, yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Good day for everyone. The talk is named Blood clotting due to thromboinflammation in the lungs decreases the pulmonary circulation. The inflammation process can lead to the thrombi formation. This is not one consequence of this process, but we will consider in our work only these consequences. As a result of the inflammation, endothelial cells of the vessel can be damaged, and as a result, the tissue factor contacts the blood plasma, which is not contacted in the normal state. As a result of this contact, the coagulation cascade is initiated, and this cascade leads to thromb formation. One of the key it includes many reactions and many proteins. One of the key proteins is thrombin or factor 2, which leads to formation of fibrin, to fibrin production. Fibrin is a gel-like structure which covers the damaged area of the vessel, and in this state it is permeable for blood, but then it can polymerize and form unpermeable clot, which covers the damaged area, and after this clot forming, the healing process begins. So in our work, we would like to investigate the influence of this inflammatory process and its consequences, thrombin formation in the vessel wall, on the global characteristics of the flow in the complex vessel network. And on the other side, the influence of blood flow is in the complex vessel network to this inflammatory process, precisely to coagulation process. The model we constructed for this investigation consists of 3 parts. This is a model of the clot growth and model of the blood flow in one vessel. When the clot grows, it affects the local conditions of the flow. It changes the geometry, so the blood flow changes, and on the other hand, the blood flow influences the clot growth because the blood can bring the factors of the coagulation cascade to the wounded area and then flow it away from this area. So these models are related to each other. And to investigate the global conditions of the flow, global parameters of the flow, like pressure and velocity in the system, we should have the model of the network, where some of the vessels can be inflamed in the sense that in this vessel the clot can grow. There are different models of the clot growth, which takes into account different parts and different detailization of the coagulation cascade. The example of such model is presented in the slide. This model is constructed and investigated in the cited article. It consists of 6 equations and 6 factors, and the picture presents the part of the coagulation cascade which this model addresses. In this article, it is shown that this model can be reduced in the model for one equation for the thrombin concentration, and in our current work we will use this model in our further constructions. This one equation model approximates the previous model consisting from 6 equations, in the sense that this one equation model gives the similar speed of thrombin concentration wave propagation. This is C in this slide. We can get the analytical estimation for this wave propagation, and this, if the sign of this speed depends on the integral in the numerator, which is integral from the right side of the equation, function f. When the speed of the thrombin concentration wave propagation is positive, it means that clot grows in the vessel, and if it is 0, it means that the clot stops to grow and it reaches its final size. We use this fact in further. For the right part of equation, for precise values of some coefficients, we can get the more similar right part, which depends on only one kinetic constant, and the increase, this is K5 in this picture, and the increase in this constant can be understand as increase in coagulation, and decrease correspondingly is decrease in coagulation. So we reduce the parameters of the model to 1 to help to ease our further conclusions for different values of such parameters. In the right side of the equation, it depends on the blood flow velocity. This, the last term is dependence on the blood flow velocity. Blood flow velocity is U, defined by U, and this is the velocity of the blood on the upper surface on the clot. It influences the clot growth in the following way. If the blood velocity is high enough, then the clot stops to grow. It's one moment. This is the picture for the reduced model for the 3 equation in this case, for the 1 equation. Thrombin, the vertical axis is thrombin concentration, and the horizontal axis is a vertical section of the vessel. So it sometimes the wave stops to propagate, and it stops on some value of the which is clot height in this case. This is for the high blood velocity. This is a picture of calculating the full model, which is this calculation done in the cited article. If the blood flow velocity is not high enough, then the wave of the thrombin concentration does not stop. And this is the case in the right part of the slide. In this case, the thrombin wave propagates to the end, to the higher bound of the vessel, this part, and the clot totally occludes the vessel. Also, this is for reduced model. This is for more precise model, numerical simulation, which is took from the cited article. So if the blood flow is high enough, then clot stops to grow. If it is not high enough, it occludes the vessel, can occlude the vessel. To estimate the blood flow on the upper boundary of the clot, we use the 2-dimensional approximation, in which we consider we suppose that the vessel have rectangular shape and there is a rectangular clot in it, and also we assume that blood flow velocity have parabolic profile before the clot, after the clot, and on the clot it also have the parabolic profile, but with changed maximal amplitude. and this is the shift from the upper clot of boundary, which help us to model that the blood flow velocity is not zero on the upper surface of the clot. So with this analytical approximation and these assumptions, we can get the formula for the blood flow velocity on the clot. This is this formula, and this velocity can be used in the previous equation for the thrombin wave concentration as approximation for the velocity above the clot, on the clot. To investigate the process in a complex network of vessels, we should have the graph of such vessels, and we consider the quasi-one-dimensional model for flow in such graphs. Such graph of the vessel network consists of arcs and vertices. Arcs represent vessels, and vertices usually represent points of vessel bifurcations, tissues, organs, and maybe heart. In our case, it would represent only the points of vessel bifurcation because we don't have such a complicated system in this case. Their flow in quasi-one-dimensional approach is described with the system of quasi-one hemodynamic equations. This is a system of mass conservation, momentum conservation, and state equation. The third equation is a cross-section area pressure relationship, which defines the dependence of cross-section area on pressure P. It is algebraic equation, so there is only two differential equations. In this formulas, S is cross-section area, U is blood flow velocity, P is pressure. Blood flow velocity is considered in the axial direction of the vessel. X is spatial coordinate, T is time. This picture is an example of such graphs, of the complicated graphs of the vessel systems. This is an example of the lymphatic system. The similar graphs there are similar graphs for the cardiovascular system. What is the approach to investigate the inflammatory process in the complex system? It consists of the following steps. We have the network level. On the network level, we can get the average velocities in each of the vessel of the graph with quasi-one-dimensional equations. Then for the inflammation vessels where theoretically the clot can grow. There is no clots at the start in these vessels, but we imply that maybe there are some inflammatory process in these vessels, and the clot can potentially start to grow in these vessels in the different flow conditions. So for these inflamed vessels, we switch to the two-dimensional model to get the velocity on the clot with the average velocity from the quasi-one-dimensional equations. So as a result, we get the velocity on the clot. This velocity on the clot is used in the right side of the equation for thrombin concentration, and with this equation we can get the sign of the thrombin wave propagation velocity. If the speed of thrombin wave propagation is 0, it means that clot stops to grow. So we can get final clot size in the inflamed vessel or vessels, and final distribution of pressure, area, and velocity and flux functions in this network. If the thrombin wave propagation speed is positive, it means that clot grows, so it does not reach its final size yet. So we As a result of thromb growth, the diameter of the vessel decreases, and so the cross-section area decreases. So we decrease the cross-section area on some small value and return to the quasi-one-dimensional system, where we can get new distributions, average distributions of pressure and velocity in the case of new cross-section area, which is smaller than previous one. We loop this process until the thrombin wave propagation speed reaches 0, or the clot totally occludes the vessels, so the cross-section area becomes 0. We use this model to investigate the thromboinflammation in the COVID-19 case. The COVID-19 disease is characterized by severe pulmonary insufficiency, by the inflammation process, and by the obstructive thrombosis in the small pulmonary vessels, in arterioles, venules, and capillaries. There is a picture with this case, the obstructive thrombosis. The arrows show thrombosis in the small blood vessels, and this is the alveoli, and this is the capillaries, blood capillaries. As a result of the obstructive thrombosis, the level of not obstructed pulmonary network is reduced, and the indirect estimation for this can be found with medical imaging, because on the medical imaging we can see the lung, the parts of lung where the damage occurs, so inflammation occurs. In this part, as consequences, there are obstructions in the blood networks, and as a result, the blood flow can decrease, and the blood flow is indirect estimation for the saturation. However, we can get the level of lung obstruction, but this correlation with the blood flow in the system is not obvious. And to investigate this question, we implement our model for this case. This is the example, this is a picture where with green shown the parts of lung tissue which are damaged as a result of inflammation. And this is not the CT image or MRI, it is the VR representation of the process. But these areas can be viewed by the medical imaging. So to investigate this question in this problem, we should have the graph of the pulmonary system, pulmonary vessel system. The pulmonary circulation, it is the place where blood oxygenates. This is the lung circulation. It starts from the right ventricle and goes, branches and goes to the left atrium. From the right ventricle, we have pulmonary artery, which branches in arterioles, goes to the pulmonary capillaries, and then they join into venules and veins. Veins are open into the left atrium. This is the pulmonary circulation is a low pressure system. The pressure, the maximal pressure systolic in the pulmonary artery is about 25 millimeters of mercury, and the average is 15 millimeters of mercury. In the left atrium, the pressure is about 2 millimeters of mercury. So the pressure gradient, if we take the medium pressure in the pulmonary artery and the pressure in the left atrium, the pressure gradient will be less than in capillaries of the big circle. So the pulmonary circulation is a low pressure system. The capillaries go to the alveoles, and they place around the alveoles, and in the alveoles the oxygen exchange is happen. So the oxygen flow from the alveoles go to the pulmonary capillaries, and then the oxygenated blood returns by the venules and veins to the left atrium. When it goes to the left atrium, it goes to the left ventricle and to the big circulation. The pulmonary system has a tree-like structure, and there are physiological models which evaluate the structure. There are different models. We take one of these models, which is supposed to be more precise. In these models, there are 15 levels of arterial branches is evaluated, and also the 15 levels of veins branching are evaluated. This is the data for the alveoles and for venules, so this digits does not take into account capillaries. This is only for pre-capillary and post-capillary parts of the system. Their maximum level is corresponds to the bigger diameter of the arterioles, and the pre-capillary vessels have the level 1. So the increase in level, it means the increase in diameter, and the more level is, the closer vessel is to the start of the system, to the right ventricle or to the left atrium. There are data about quantity of the vessels in each tree level, and diameters, average diameters was standard deviation for each vessel on the level, and length for each vessel of the level. We use this data to create the graph of the pulmonary system. This graph is presented in the right part. It has 4 levels of pulmonary vessels. The 20 level have the bigger diameter, the 9th level have less diameter. The branching is the branching corresponds to the data from the physiological data, and the volume, the presented part of the pulmonary system is about 1% of the, or even about 1% of the total volume if we calculate the total volume of the lung of the pulmonary circulation with this data. However, the results can be interpreted in more system in the whole lungs. To investigate the inflammatory process in this network, we first do the benchmark. This is initial distributions of pressure, velocity, cross-section area, and flux, along with the tracks for the case where there is no inflamed vessels. That is, there is no vessels where clot can grow. Track includes vessels from each level, and there are 3 kinds of distributions which marked with its own colors, and color of the track corresponds to the color of the lines in the plots. So they are similar, and this is the initial data, for especially for the flux and cross-section area, to which we can compare the case where there are inflamed vessels in the system. As a boundary conditions, we use pressure, and this is a linear approximation for the pressure. we didn't find more precise approximations for the pressure in the pulmonary vessels in the literature by now. So use linear. In the next calculation, we consider the inflamed vessels. Some of the vessels are inflamed. They are marked with bold in the left figure, and the bold vessels are inflamed. It means that the clot possibly can grow in these vessels. However, at the initial state, there is no clot in these vessels. So the clot is not the input for the model, but this is the output of the model, whether the clot grow in the vessel when in different flow conditions. As a result of calculation of this model with the same initial and boundary conditions and parameters for the network as in previous case, we get the following results. There are some vessels in blue vessels of 10th level. We have small clots, a bigger ones in green vessels, but still it is quite low, about 10% of the total diameter. And there in orange vessels, in 10th level of orange vessels, the vessels become occluded by clots. So as a result of the calculation, we get as a result of this occlusion, the volume of the network changes, it reduces, and if we compare to the non-inflammatory state, it reduces on 5%. Flux in the system also reduces, and this reduction is 13% for this case. In the picture, the main global flow functions, its distributions are shown in comparison with the not inflamed state. In the inflamed state, we can see that for orange vessels, their clot totally occludes the vessel, and as a result, they totally occlude the vessels, only these vessels which were inflamed. So it is 10th level, not 9th, but the flow is absent on both levels, which are followed by the obstructed vessel.
Anastasia, 3 minutes left.
Yes, thank you. The pressure distribution function for different pressure gradients and for different coagulation are mainly the same in this picture. So in other pictures, we present only the final volume and final flux for the different pressure gradients. This is pressure gradient 0.2 and this is 0.3 between left and right parts of the vessel tree. And this is the plots of which show dependence of flux and volume on the coagulation, on the increase of coefficient K5. The increase in this coefficient means increased coagulation. So with increase in coagulation, the flux decreases, and this decrease is not linear, but the curves are similar for different pressure gradients. And volume is also decreases more roughly than flux. Also, we can plot the dependence of flux difference depending on volume difference. As a result, for each case, we get some volume, and when we find its relation to the initial volume in not inflamed state, we can get volume difference. And this is the horizontal axis in this plot, and flux difference, the same procedure, how many flux left in the system after the volume reduction. So we get this graph, and this graph we can see the results. We have the same plot lines for the different pressure gradients. So about when the volume changes, decreases about 5%, the flux decreases about 13%, and we do it up to a volume decrease of 16% when the flux decreases more than a half. As conclusion for the model, we state that even small volume change can lead to important flux reduction, and the model can give an estimate for this flux reduction. This work is supported, and the number of agreement is shown on the slide, and the results were recently published in this article. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Anastasia. I am very impressed because, well, as I understand, this is one of the first models of systemic blood coagulation, and it is a really multi-scale model. So please, if somebody have questions, we have time for them. Well, I have a question. Could you please explain? Well, you have different you have several branches, and the reduction of the volume is different, of the flux and volume is different in this branches of the same level. Why it is so? When in some of the previous slides with different colors, when there are branches colored differently. Yes, for example, here on the below.
This reduction, yes. This is not maybe a correct imaging, because the pressure when the vessel is totally obstructed, so we have these parts, there is no pressure of fluid because there is no fluid in this part. So before the clot, pressure tends to the same values was before. Maybe I go to the bigger picture. This part is totally occluded. So in this, pressure tends to this value. It is not the same because we have flow on these branches. And in this part, pressure tends to the zero value. So it can be considered as not very correct imaging of this process. The pressure here is the same.
I do not understand. Yeah, but I don't understand why, for example, one of the vessels thrombosis, the thrombus forms in the one of the vessels and does not form in the three vessels marked by blue color. Why they are different? What is the difference between these vessels?
Difference in clot size in inflamed vessels. In the blue colors, it's not obstruct the vessel. It has some small value, but the blood still flows. And in orange vessels, it totally obstructs the vessels. It can be as numerical calculation and totally obstruct. So there is no flow in these vessels. As I
but why?
Maybe I can comment a little bit on this question. But the answer, in fact, is very simple, because this network is not completely symmetric. If you look at these orange vessels, you see there are 3 of them at the end, and for blue vessels, there are 4 of them.
Ah, I see. I see. They are different.
Yeah, they are different.
Yes.
Also, these green vessels, they are also different. So because of this difference, pressure distribution, velocity distribution are different, and this is why in some vessels clots grow, and some others they do not grow.
And I would like to comment one more. The branching was done according to the physiological data. So in the human organs, there are also the parts, we can conclude that there are parts of the network where is highly highly probability of clot growing higher than in other parts.
And does there really branches to the four equal branches? Yes, it's really, or it is an approximation?
We use the data from the amount of the vessels on each level. So this is average data. It can branches to 3 or 4. It depends on this values of number. In the real case, of course, I think I don't specialize in this question, but I think it can branches different, but there is average results from the physiological data.
I see.
Well, in fact, this vessel tree is very complex, and even the definition of generations is not at all obvious, because they do in all directions, they at different points. So I think, as Anastasia says, that this ratio, the number of vessels is, as it's shown in the table, is proportional to the total number of vessels. But the bifurcation points can be maybe a little bit moved from each other. You see what I mean? So it may be not exactly the same point. It can be moved a little bit.
Yes, I see. I see.
So this is, of course,
I see. And my well, another question. There was antithrombin in the initial model, but then it was removed from the model. Yes.
Yes, we consider the fixed value for other coefficients, and there was some procedure which with we can reduce model for this case. In fact, it depends on the precise values of these coefficients, and we calculate it can be neglected compared to these parts of the equation.
Okay, thank you. We have some more time for questions, if there are. Please, dear listeners.
No, in fact, no, we don't have time. In fact, it's already time to start the next presentation.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Then thank you, Anastasia. And our next speaker is Megalinsky. Alexey, yes.
Andrei. Yeah.
Okay. Andrei Megalinsky from Moscow State University and Center for Chemical Problems of Pharmacology, with the presentation titled "Initiation of Coagulation Reactions under the arterial flow is supported by the immobilized phospholipids." So please, Andrei, please start.
Thank you. Can you hear me, and can you see my screen?
Yes, we can hear you, and please, could you please do the full screen mode?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank organizing committee for the opportunity to present my work, which is aimed at studying fibrin clot formation under conditions of arterial shield rates. The hemostatic response occurs when the vascular wall is damaged, and two components of hemostasis are generally distinguished: the primary hemostasis and the secondary hemostasis. Primary hemostasis includes the aggregation of platelets which form so-called white thrombi, and the secondary hemostasis is associated with the formation of a fibrin network which acts like a glue. You already see this picture today, but I'll tell some more words about it. The primary and the secondary components of hemostasis affect each other. This slide shows a simplified cascade of blood clotting reactions. And to make a long story short, after the vascular wall is damaged, tissue factor is exposed to the blood, leading to the thrombin activation here it is. So the thrombin is a central enzyme in the coagulation cascade, and it's also a potent activator of platelets. Platelets in turn accelerate coagulation reactions by several mechanisms. So we also know that the presence of phospholipid surfaces can accelerate the most important reactions in coagulation cascade in system without flow. But the role of phospholipid fraction in the presence of the flow still do not completely understood. Well, it is generally accepted that under arterial blood flow conditions, formation of a platelet aggregate may protect coagulation reactions from the dilution by the blood flow. The flow can significantly affect both primary and secondary of coagulation cascade and fibrin polymerization process. So one of the intriguing questions is, how do coagulation reactions occur under conditions of arterial flow without platelets? So this is the main question we are trying to answer, what we are trying to figure out. In the presence of plasma flow without platelets, the coagulation demonstrate threshold behavior by several key parameters. The shear rate, the tissue factor density, and the size of the region contains the tissue factor. The detailed mechanisms that regulate initiation of plasma coagulation under flow conditions and determine the values of these thresholds remain poorly understood. Returning to in vivo hemostasis, the fundamental questions address the exact consequence of events leading to the platelet activation. These burning questions are: is there any scenarios in vivo when thrombin generation precedes and mediates platelet activation and aggregation? And another interesting question is whether plasma coagulation can stop bleeding without platelets under specific conditions. So the general aim of this work is to answer the following questions. How do initiation of coagulation at high shear rates is possible? And how does the fibrin polymerization propagates in space? We investigated the role of an immobilized phospholipids in the initial stages of plasma coagulation in high shear flow by combining in vitro experimental approach with computational models. We first performed in vitro experiments to investigate the spatial dynamics of fibrin polymerization under high shear conditions and high surface density of tissue factor. Here is the brief idea of that experiment. The vesicles containing tissue factor protein are applied locally to the polycarbonate surface. Then we pump platelet-free blood plasma through the flow chamber, and to detect fibrin polymerization, we add fluorescently labeled fibrinogen and observe the process in real time. So here is how our microfluidic flow chamber design looks like. For this purpose, we used these microfluidic chambers. Here is the schematic picture of it. It has 3 channels. Each channel has an inlet on the right where platelet-free plasma is injected. On the left is the outlet where all the solutions are pumped out with the syringe pump. And there is also an additional inlet for the injection heparin into the system. The position of the tissue factor stripe in the assembled system is shown in red. On the right, we see the assembled chip. This is a slide view in a cross section along one of these channels. The area with the tissue factor is shown also in red. A general view of an experimental system is shown below. Well, we detected the processes of fibrin clot formation in activator region using fluorescence microscopy methods. After that, we analyzed its spatio-temporal dynamics, and here you can see the accelerated video of fibrin polymerization process. Fibrin is first detected downstream the activator region and propagates against the flow. Interestingly, it is almost reached the beginning of the activator, which is depicted here with white line. Let me start it once again. The flow direction shows here. Well, to analyze the spatial dynamics, we plotted the dependence of average fibrinogen fluorescence signal on the distance to the activator boundary. In this case, the activator means immobilized phospholipid vesicles containing tissue factor. On the left plot, here you can see the evolution of the intensity profiles. To determine the position of the upstream border of fibrin, we used 10% criteria for the intensity value as shown by the horizontal line. On the right plot, the change in the position of the upstream border of fibrin is shown with time. It starts after several minutes downstream and slows down after about 10 minutes, reaching the distance about 100 micrometers downstream the beginning of the activator. Since the process of fibrin polymerization depends on activity of thrombin, such coagulation kinetics indicates rapid production of thrombin. Importantly, this process occurs at arterial shear rates and in the absence of platelets. To explain these results, we used a reduced model of the initial stages of coagulation. This mathematical model allows us to study the impact of various parameters on the spatio-temporal dynamics of thrombin production. For simplification, these models did not describe the process of fibrin polymerization. We have made an assumption that initiation of polymerization takes place when thrombin reaches a threshold concentration of 1 nanomole. This slide shows a simplified scheme of the coagulation cascade describing the process of thrombin formation via the tissue factor pathway. This system includes key reactions responsible only for the initiation of clotting. The 2D model represents a central slice of our flow chamber, and the flow is considered constant and having parabolic profile, as it's shown on the right. Well, the equations are divided into surface reactions and volume reactions. The surface reactions take place on the phospholipids which contain tissue factor. The key substances here are activated and non-activated tinase, as well as the bound factor 5 and unbound factor 5, factor 10, both activated and unactivated. We also consider prothrombinase and the available phospholipids. The volume reactions are shown here. Both diffusion and convection terms are included here. And we use the COMSOL multiphysics software, which implements the finite element method to solve partial differential equations. This slide shows the geometric parameters of the model and the heat maps of thrombin concentration distribution in the area of 130 micrometers away from the activator boundary. The heat maps are shown for the 3 time points, 0 minutes, 10 minutes, and 20 minutes. The scale represents concentrations values in nanomoles. This is how the kinetics of thrombin production in this mathematical model looks like. Here we see that physiologically significant thrombin concentrations of tens of nanomoles are reached at the time scale of a minute downstream the beginning of the activator region and propagates against the flow. So it starts, it starts here and then propagates against the flow. It's hard to see, I'm sorry, but this is the best we can do. In order to analyze the dynamics of thrombin production, depending on the concentration of tissue factor and phospholipids, we obtained kinetic curves of thrombin concentration in the damaged region for several values of model parameters. Well, this model demonstrates high sensitivity to the surface density of available phospholipids. For a zero concentration of immobilized phospholipid fraction, this model fails to generate significant thrombin production, even in case of very high values of surface density of the tissue factor. When we introduce the surface localized phospholipids into the model, it is possible to describe a rapid thrombin production above a threshold of 1 micromole. At sufficiently high surface densities of phospholipids, the thrombin concentration reaches the threshold in a few tenths of seconds after activation. Our two-dimensional model of coagulation initiation also allows us to correlate the simulation results with the experimental data. For this purpose, we plotted the time to reach the threshold concentration of thrombin as a function of a distance to the beginning of the area with activator. The simulation results are in qualitative agreement with the representative experimental data and demonstrate a significant increase in the coagulation lag time and for activator regions located at the distance closer than 100 micrometers to the upstream activator boundary. However, at the initial stages of this process, there is a significant difference between the model predictions and experimental kinetics. Here we see. This is likely due to the fact that in the experiment we observe fibrin polymerization process, but not thrombin production. Fibrin monomers generated by thrombin are expected to be transferred by the flow to the downstream regions before the polymerization process occurs. However, this hypothesis has to be confirmed or rejected by our future work. In conclusion, it's necessary to say that our mathematical model predicts the key role of the immobilized phospholipid fraction in thrombin production under arterial shear rates. Binding of coagulation factors to the immobilized fraction of phospholipids may both protect coagulation factors from the dilution, because molecules can bind the phospholipids instead of flowing away, and accelerate coagulation reactions by the process of concentration of molecules on the surface. Well, I would like to thank my scientific advisors, my colleagues, and also Center of Theoretical Problems of Physical-Chemical Pharmacology for possibility to make this work done. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Andrei. We have 10 minutes for questions, please. Well, yes, Vitaly.
Yes, thank you for this nice work and nice presentation, Andrei. Well, I have some questions. In particular, you mentioned that if I am not mistaken, that in the absence of phospholipids, even if you have high concentration of tissue factor, you don't observe clot growth. Is it correct what I say? I mean,
yes, it's absolutely.
But isn't it strange? Because usually in the usual physiological conditions, tissue factor expressed at the wall is sufficient to initiate clot growth. So could you explain us what happens here?
Well, you mean that in vivo experiments, it is enough to have sufficient concentration of tissue factor without significant concentration of phospholipids to produce enough thrombin to start the process of coagulation, right?
Right.
Yeah. So it is really hard to answer, but our thoughts is that this process will take place not only in first moments of starting the coagulation, but after maybe several minutes. And yeah, maybe there is some parts in the model we did not include in this version. Maybe you should look at this later, but
no, sorry, my question is not only about the model, but rather about the experiments. If I understand you correctly, in the experiments, you don't observe clot growth without phospholipids.
No, in the experiment, we did not provide this kind of experiment. Yeah, it's only a modeling result.
In the experiments, you always have phospholipids, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I see. Okay, so one possible reason, but it's really difficult for me to say without knowing exactly what happens, that maybe flow velocity is too high. This is, in fact, is my second question about flow velocity. If flow velocity is too high, then indeed it just does not allow the clot to grow. So did you try to vary flow velocity in the experiments and in your modeling?
This is the part which I am doing right now. So this like an results is not shown at this presentation, but I can say that in the flow shear rate about 200 reversed seconds, we see first we see fibrinogen after 30 seconds of blood plasma inlets this region. So there is a dependence of flow shear rate, and we are working on it right now.
Yes, certainly there is dependence, and there are experimental results in the literature which show how clot growth depends on the wall shear rate. So please take this into account. There are some experimental results in the literature, and there is some threshold transition if this wall shear rate exceeds some critical level, then the clot will not grow, but if it is not high enough, the clot will grow, and the transition is quite sharp. So, well, I don't remember right now the reference. I don't, Anas Bushnite, if present here, maybe he will recall us because he worked with these experimental results and modeled them. So please take into account the flow velocity and shear rate is very important in these experiments and in the model. Yes, and to finish my short comments and questions, and I remember that I also discussed it with probably your advisor, Dmitry Nichiporenko, that in fact, what you present with these experiments and with this model is reminds a lot chemical reactors, flow reactors. Are you familiar a little bit with that?
I'm afraid not.
Yeah, so, well, this is in fact, it's a little bit another area of research and engineering. It's a huge area because they're largely used in chemical industry, of course, and so on. So, but the setup is very close. You have this flow and chemical reaction or chemical reactions, and it can be homogeneous reactions in the bulk, or it can be surface reactions. There are many different possibilities depending on this reaction.
Yeah, I think. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for interrupting you.
So many in flow. Sorry.
Vitaly, we can hardly hear you.
Okay. Then I stop with my comments. So take please into account these questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Vitaly. And I suggest there are some questions in the chat. Well, Andrei, you can also read them. Here is a comment. Article of Shen. Yes, Anas, I suggest that, well, Andrei cited this article. Well, I can switch on your microphone if you like, Anas.
Yeah, I think Anas is talking about this results. I'm sorry, I still.
Yeah, I think these are the same results. Yes, but yeah, and also I think there are 3 or 4 like that, but yeah, they show the same phenomenon. So there is this threshold that inhibits the initiation of blood coagulation.
The question is the magnitude of this threshold, because here we have a threshold at about 5 or 40 inverse seconds, and as far as I understand, Alexey Shebeka conducted a theoretical work in which the threshold was about 10 inverse or 20 maybe inverse seconds, but here Andrei has 1,000 inverse seconds.
Yeah.
It is,
So this arterial shear rates. Yeah.
Yes. So the question, what do you expect, Andrei? Do you expect that there is a real threshold, or what?
Yeah, we expect some kind of threshold here. So I can say, as I already said, that this experiment lasts 20 minutes, and first fibrin region with fibrin we see after maybe 3 or 4 minutes from starting this experiment. And if we decrease the shear rate 5 times, this time will be about half a minute. So I still do not really know how many points of different shear rates should we take to investigate the whole process. Yeah, but I think this is one of the criteria we should vary and to find out what will happen.
And my question is, well, here you have fiber formation far below activation boundary. So as far as I remember, for example, Alexey Shubek, when modeled it, he is Alexey he is here, as I understand. Well, I suggest that this is not a calculation. Well, this is a calculation far below the boundary, so the boundary does not is not covered by fibrin here. So maybe it is already above the threshold.
Yeah.
So maybe yes, maybe here the calculation is, but it is not on the tissue factor, so it is not the thrombus formation that is that has physiological meaning. Yes, for could you comment, please?
Yeah, if I understand you right, your question is there any fibrin mesh above this region?
Yes.
Maybe here.
Yes.
Yeah. It is not, because after each experiment I observe the whole this this channel to find out is there any spontaneous clots or maybe regions with mesh which can which influence our experiment, and in most cases it is there are no regions with fibrin mesh, and if they are, I just delete this experiment from the numbers of experiments and for the experiment which we analyze.
I see. Okay, so well, I see. So the question is, what is what is calculation? What can be what can be what calculation is in this case? Well, what is the definition of calculation which can be used here? Okay.
Okay.
Yes. So thank you very much. Other questions, please? No. Okay. Then we will switch to our next last but not least speaker.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Игорь, I suggest Eltsov. Yes, Igor Eltsov. From the Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology, and as I understand, also from the Faculty of Physics of the Lomonosov Moscow State University, and his talk will be about microtubule dynamics and the influence of temperature on this dynamics.
Okay, thank you. Could you see my screen and hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, good afternoon. Today I will talk about the model of Brownian dynamics of microtubules. In particular, I will focus on taking into account the temperature dependence in this model. Microtubules are a component of the cytoskeleton found in almost all eukaryotic cells. Microtubules play an extraordinary role in many cell processes, especially during division in mitosis. Microtubules look for chromosomes catch to them, line up the equator of the cell, and then spread the chromosomes to the poles of the cells. Besides their role in dividing cells, they also play a role in migrating cells, neuron, immune cells, platelets, and others. Microtubules are hollow cylinders with a diameter of 25 nanometers. They consist of dimers of tubulin. Tubulin dimers join each other longitudinally and to form a protofilament. And further, binding bilateral connections, the protofilament stick together and form a microtubule whole. Microtubules grow in two steps, respectively, by attaching tubulin dimers to the end of the protofilament is the first step, and then the adjacent to protofilament to each other. Protofilament stick to each other to form a microtubule, and then microtubule grows. An important feature of microtubules, which determines most of its function, is its dynamic instability. When the microtubule switch from the stage of slow growth to the stage of rapid disassembly. An important role of these processes is GTP hydrolysis. GTP inside in tubulin, and tubulin molecules with GTB is green are less likely to form microtubules. But the attached tubulin with GTP molecules at the end of the microtubule form a GTP cap, which keeps the microtubule in its normal state. Okay, let's now move on the microtubule model, the video of which we just saw. Tubulin dimers could be attached to the end of the protofilament, and we modeled this interaction and as potential we can see and picture below. A similar interaction occurs in lateral connection, thanks to which protofilaments are connected to each other. So using this model, we decide to investigate one phenomenon associated with microtubules, which is quite well known to many people, but little is known about its cause. This effect is that the microtubule catastrophizes quickly, disassembly, that is, when the temperature drops. At a normal temperature above 20 degrees, the microtubule also catastrophes, as I have shown, but this process is stochastic, and after the catastrophe, the growth of the microtubules continues. When the temperature drops, catastrophe occurs almost immediately, and further growth is no longer observed. Therefore, in order to understand this phenomena, that when the temperature decreased, the microtubule would seem to prefer a less ordered state, that is disassembly and tubulin are in solution. Its behavior is very different from the behavior of ordinary substance, which with decrease in temperature prefer a more stable state. So we focused on the temperature dependence of the assembly and disassembly of microtubules. The previous model, unlike most of parameters that the model describes well, it rather poorly describes the temperature dependence of assembly rates of microtubules. Here we can see the red dots is simulation data, and black dots is experimental data. Meanwhile, the disassembly of microtubules agree well enough with the experiment. In the case of disassembly, pearl triangles and green diamond is a simulation data. The rest is experimental data. In order to take into account correctly the temperature dependence of the assembly of the microtubule on, it is also necessary to take into account the change in the movement of tubulin in solution when the temperature decrease or increase, the movement of tubulin in solution is changed. So, as far for the speed of assembly of microtubules, the first remark that comes out is that the speed of assembly is not limited by the diffusion of tubulin molecules. The estimate of the number of collisions per second is very different from the characteristic growth rate, whereas on average, 30 dimers of tubulin are attached to the microtubule per second. They collide with end of microtubule by order of magnitude, about 15,000 at the same concentration of tubulin. Also, an analytical calculation with some simplifications for the tubulin diffusion equations was also shown. In it, the growth rate of the microtubule can be limited by diffusion only if it's 10 times higher than the characteristic rates in vivo. In vivo characteristic rates is 7 micrometers per min, but only in rates with 65 micrometers per meter, the rate of growth is limited by diffusion. Thus, for the physiological rates, the concentration of tubulin near tip is the same as the solution, as we can see in the figure. Our assumption is that this trait is associated with the presence of energy barrier when tubulins are attached to the end of the protofilament. One of the possible reasons for this presence of energy barrier may be the presence of tubulin alpha tail that prevent attachment to another tubulin. A zone of longitudinal interaction is highlighted here, where tubulin connect to each other longitudinally. And the molecular dynamics of the behavior of the alpha tail of tubulin is carried out, and can be seen that it can restrain with the longitudinal with connection of tubulin. For some time, alpha tail is located on the zone, thereby preventing the binding of tubulin. This may contribute to the energy barrier in some way. We should consider this energy barrier. However, it is not possible to simulate all possible tubulin molecules that float in solution and can collide with the end of the microtubules. So we decided to consider a fairly general problem of transition of the particle through the energy barriers, and used in this model these theoretical results. I will just list only the general principle and simplifications that have been applied. The continuous equation is used. We have a concentration of some point and the flow of the particles, and the flow of particles from is represented as the have two terms. One term with diffusion is associated with Brownian motion of particles, and some term associated with the force when associated with the potential where the particles are located. We believe that the flow of the particle passing through the energy barrier is weak, so we can ignore the change in the concentration. As we have seen, this is meaningful since the growth of the microtubule doesn't reduce the concentration of tubulin near to the tip of microtubule at physiological constants of the rate. We also neglect the flow of particles in the opposite direction. And finally, the integral obtained from the equation is basically type at the top of the barrier, and it's thus the resulting particles flow depends only on the maximum of the barrier and its curvature at the maximum point. The resulting flow is exponentially dependent on the maximum and maximum of barrier, and curvature MW0 in square is curvature of potential in the maximum. We conducted a simulation of the transition of particles through the energy barrier in the one-dimensional case. Each particles can make random Brownian walks, and it also affected by a force caused by the presence of a potential. Here is shown a rare case when a particle still passes through the barrier. And modeling for a large number of particles, we looked at how many particles pass through the energy barrier per unit time. Here, the red curvature is an analytical calculated quantity of the flow and multiplied by time. And the black dots is the simulations data. Accordingly, the theory agrees very well with the simulation. I want to draw attention to the fact that there are no parameters for adjustment in the simulations. So this can say that theoretical describes very well this behavior of the case. Now you can apply almost the same for the three-dimensional case. Consider a three-dimensional spherically symmetric case. That is, the binding of the energy of particles with each other depends only on the distance between the binding sides. This case can easily be reduced to one-dimensional one, except that in addition to the magnitude of the potential, it will be the area of the maximum potential. That is the area of the sphere at which the maximum potential is achieved. Thus, we obtain the constant of the transition of the particles through the barrier K1. It exponentially depends on the size of the barrier. Also depends on its curvature, MW0 square, and the area of this barrier itself. And also it depends on diffusion coefficient of mobile particles in solution. These results bring us back to our model. In the previous model, the dependence of the growth rate on temperature was purely described as the addition constant K1 was a constant that didn't depend on temperature. Now we can take this dependency into account. Also, knowing the addition constant at temperature of 37 degrees, you can get an estimate for the value of the energy barrier from the formula for the addition constant K1. We will get an estimate for the energy barrier value approximately equal to 5.5 kT. Let's now look at the temperature dependence of the assembly speed. Here the black dots are experimental data. The red curve is a theoretically calculated curve. Take it into account only the K1 addition constant. Vertically, the growth rate normalized by concentration. It can be seen that the dependence of the growth rate describe the temperature dependence a little better. And in the future, a simulation that takes into account this theoretical curve, as well as off-rate behavior of tubulin molecules, and also consider the later bond, it is possible to bring this behavior of this temperature dependence closer to experimental data. So we have come to the conclusion of the work. To avoid explicit modeling of tubulin molecules in solution, it is possible to describe the addition of tubulin as the passage of particles through the energy barriers. And the value of such barrier is estimated to be 3.4 kilocalorie per mole and or 5.5 kT. The obtained dependence on the temperature of the K1 constant improves the description of the temperature dependence of the assembly speed of microtubules. And so we have some plans in the future. It is to obtain simulation data on the dependence of the microtubule growth on temperature, the size of barrier, to conduct an experiment with dynamic microtubules at different temperature, as well as with quick cooling of the solution, and see this phenomenon of the microtubule and describe this phenomena of disassembly or catastrophize of the microtubule and the loss of its dynamic instability at low temperature. All this work couldn't be done without a large march of people. I would like to thank Nikita Gudimchuk, Evgeny Ulyanov, Dmitry Vinogradov, who developed this microtubule model and continue to improve it. Thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to answer the questions.
Thank you very much, Igor. I have a short question. It is well accepted technique in the chemical kinetics to study the temperature dependence of rate constant and to conclude for first of all activation energy from them, and then to study the switching from diffusion control to kinetic control. Well, did you try to find the energy barrier from your experimental data?
Yes, we try the only describe this dependence as this formula of temperature dependence without any constants of tubulin diffusion coefficient, or maybe radius of the dimers of tubulins. I can show also this graphics. This red line is similar, is a theoretical constant K on, and the green line is approximate only the temperature dependence of this for the K on from T, and energy barriers in this case could be approximately is too high, or estimated as 9 kT, but it is only theoretical dependencies which cannot take into account K off and maybe lateral bond. Now we conduct the simulation with constant K on describes in this work, and the simulation data is not very much of this. We have only some points, blue point of this experimental data, or not experimental data, simulation data, blue point. And we see that the curvature of theoretical line of constant K on is higher than the experimental point, and simulation data agree with the experimental data with this line.
Well, my question is as follows: when you plot the logarithm of velocity as a function of reciprocal temperature, so you plot in different coordinates, in semi-logarithmic and semi-reciprocal coordinates, you probably will obtain the straight line which angle is proportional to the activation energy. So this is the well-known approach to study this kind of
systems. Yes, it's for chemical reaction when we consider the chemical reaction in one point. In this, this is not only chemical reaction, is also the tubulin movement in the solution. So we have not only for energy barrier of temperature, we also have a diffusion coefficient of the dependence of temperature. So in really the dependence of the dynamic viscosity in the solution is also can great value of this behavior.
Yes, and that's why this approach is used to study the transition from diffusion control to the kinetic control. You have the very same situation. You have the equation whether your system is kinetically controlled or diffusion controlled. Okay, thank you very much. We have
Thank you.
another question. Please, Vitaly.
Yes, hopefully again it will be better with sound. So as far as I remember, you told us in the beginning of your presentation that the critical temperature is about 20 degrees. Is it right?
No, not it is estimate of the critical temperature. This critical temperature depends also of the concentration of tubulin. In one tubulin concentration, it could be 10. In another tubulin concentration, it could be more.
For example, if you take physiological concentrations, then what is the critical temperature approximately?
Approximately 15. I don't know exact.
15,
Approximately 15.
About 15 degrees Celsius, right?
10, 15, yes.
Well, but then my question is about, it looks like it's not a very low temperature, and usual biological tissues, apparently nothing dangerous happens for the temperature 15 degrees. For example, if you go outside and it is 15 degrees temperature, so okay, so at the surface of my hand, it will be like about 15 degrees. And so the tissue function normally. So could you explain this point, please? Because as you told us, indeed, this
Yes.
tubulins are very important for the normal functioning of cells, and its functioning changed drastically at the temperature 15 degrees, but we don't observe it in our everyday life.
So I don't know in this case because we study while only on the in vitro situation, and situation in vivo I really don't know.
But the in vitro experiments show really this difference at this critical temperature, right?
Yes.
I believe these experiments are not on the human system, but maybe on yeast or whatever.
Well, but no, but you know, this microfibers are probably the same for all. I don't know, in fact, but I would assume that they are basically the same for all animals because it's just animal cells.
Basically the same, but from species to species, interspecies variation maybe even small variations may greatly affect the kinetics.
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure that it concerns because it's really kinetics of microtubules assembly. It does not depend on like other molecules, other things. It's really only microtubules, and I assume that they can be basically the same, but I don't know. Anyway, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation, and I think that we finish this session. I would like to thank all speakers and also our chairman, and I recall you that we meet in 1 hour for the next session.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.